The Nova cruiser cut a solitary figure against the vast backdrop of the cosmos, its sleek silver hull reflecting the distant light of 1,000 stars. It was more than just a ship. It was a testament to the Galactic Concordance's vision, a melting pot of species and technologies all united under a single cause of peace and exploration. Each module and deck within the cruiser was designed to accommodate the diverse biological needs of its crew, from the oxygen-rich environments for humans to the dim, cooler chambers preferred by the nocturni of Helion sector. Luminara's mind drifted inexorably back to Citrus 4, to the day the sky had rained fire and death. The Xanthor had come without warning, their ships blotting out the sun as they descended upon the mining outpost. She remembered the chaos, the screams, the desperate scramble for safety as everything she knew was reduced to ash and echoes. Her hands clenched into fists at the memory, the rawness of it still searing. The ship's intercom crackled to life, pulling her from her reverie. "Scout Zen, please report to command, briefing in 10, the voice of the AI, crisp and devoid of emotion, announced. Luminara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had survived the Xanthor, but survival was no longer enough. She had duties here, a role to play in this grand experiment of peace. As she made her way through the corridors, she observed her fellow crew members. A pair of human engineers debated over a holographic display of engine schematics. A group of Varn aliens shared a meal in their segmented language, clicks and tones she had yet to master. Arriving at the command center, Luminara was greeted by a scene of controlled activity. Screens displayed data streams in multiple languages, and the central table showed a holographic model of their next patrol sector. At the head of the table stood Lieutenant Don Carlos, a man whose reputation for bravery and strategic acumen was only matched by his compassionate leadership. "Sen, glad you could join us," Carlos said, his voice warm, the slight accent hinting at his Earth origins. Luminara nodded, her expression unreadable. "Lieutenant," she replied, maintaining the formal distance she felt more comfortable with. Carlos smiled slightly as if aware of her discomfort and choosing not to comment. "We have a situation developing near the outer rim," he began, gesturing to the hologram. "Increased Xanthor activity. We're to investigate and offer support where necessary. I want your eyes on this, Zen. You know them better than anyone." The mission was clear, but the underlying challenge was not lost on Luminara. This was her chance to prove her worth among this eclectic crew, to move beyond the past and perhaps in doing so reshape her future. As the briefing continued, Luminara felt a shift within her, a stirring of something she had not anticipated. Hope, perhaps, or the first flicker of belonging. Here in the cold vastness of space aboard the Nova cruiser, she might finally find a way to leave the shadows of Citrus 4 behind, to contribute to a peace she had never dared to hope for. And with each star that streaked past, she felt the weight of her past losses lessen, her horizon ever so slightly brighten. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past. The stars outside the viewport danced in muted flickers, their light competing with the ambient glow that bathed the interior of the Nova cruiser's observation deck. Luminara Zen stood alone, her silhouette stark against the vast expanse of the cosmos. Her eyes, wide and contemplative, were not on the stars but lost in the darker spaces between them. The tranquility of the moment belied the tumult of her mind. The past, a shadow she could never seem to outrun, crept upon her once more. Her breath caught as the memory surged, vivid and unbidden, a torrent that washed over her senses and plunged her back into the heart of chaos. Citrus 4 had been a desolate outpost, a speck of civilization on the fringes of known space, its skies perpetually veiled by the thick ochre dust that rose from its barren landscapes. But it was there, among the stark cliffs and deep canyons carved by ancient waters long gone, that Luminara had known purpose. As a scout for the Celestial Command, her days had been spent patrolling the rugged terrain, her nights under a canopy of uncountable stars. Then the Xanthor came, as sudden as a solar flare and just as destructive. The memory unfolded in sharp fragments, the shriek of alarm slicing through the outpost, the ground trembling beneath the thunderous assault of Xanthor drop pods. Luminara had grabbed her gear, her heart pounding a frenetic rhythm as she ran towards the armory, her steps in sync with the blasts that rocked the compound. The sky had turned a deeper shade of red, the dust stirred into swirling storms by the invaders' descent. The Xanthor, insectoid figures of nightmares, had swarmed through the outpost with brutal efficiency. Their chitin-armored bodies glistened under the harsh emergency lights, mandibles clicking with savage anticipation as they tore through the defenses put up by the terrified miners and few stationed scouts. Luminara, along with her squad, had fought back fiercely. Each blast from her rifle was a fleeting victory in the overwhelming tide of war. She remembered the heat of the rifle's barrel, the sharp smell of ozone and scorched earth, the way her comrades' voices had risen in both courage and fear. But more than anything, she remembered the screams, those of friends and foes alike, that had pierced the cacophony of battle. The Xanthor had been relentless. Luminara's last stand had been by the communication tower, a desperate attempt to call for evac before a blast had thrown her to the ground, her consciousness flickering like the failing lights around her. When she had awoken, it was to the sight of ruin and the bitter ash of defeat. Bodies, both human and Xanthor, littered the ground like fallen leaves. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled only with the mournful winds that carried the echoes of the lost. Back in the present, Luminara blinked away the remnants of the memory, her chest tight with unshed tears. The pain of loss still gnawed at her, a reminder of all that had been taken. Yet, as she turned away from the viewport and the ghosts that haunted her there, a spark of resolve lit within her. She would not let despair define her. The Xanthor had taken much, but not her will, not her need to stand again, to fight not just for survival, but for a future where such horrors could be prevented. With each step back towards the heart of the Nova Cruiser, Luminara felt the weight of her past become not a shackle, but a mantle she chose to bear. In the halls of the cruiser, among allies and strangers from 1,000 worlds, Luminara Zen would forge a new path, one lit not by the stars, but by the fire of her own indomitable spirit. Chapter 3. A Tense Alliance. The vast conference room aboard the Nova Cruiser seemed to stretch even wider as Lieutenant Don Carlos entered. The lighting was subdued, casting long shadows that flickered across the tactical maps displayed on the screens. At the far end of the room stood Luminara Zen, her silhouette edged by the soft glow of the star charts projected behind her. Her eyes, reflecting the distant pinpricks of starlight, flicked towards Carlos as he approached. "Scout Zen," he greeted, his voice carrying a formal chill as it sliced through the quiet. "Lieutenant," Luminara responded, her tone equally measured. She didn't move, her posture rigid, almost defiant. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, assessing, calculating. In her eyes, Carlos saw not just the blue of Citros IV's skies, but the coldness of its nights. Carlos took a seat opposite her at the briefing table, its surface gleaming subtly in the low light. The air between them was thick with unspoken histories and the weight of their respective worlds. They were like two celestial bodies drawn into an uneasy orbit, their gravitational pull a mix of necessity and reluctance. "Command has assigned us to assess the threat levels at the Virex colony," Carlos began, his fingers tapping on a datapad to bring up the relevant data. "Recent intel suggests potential Xanthor activity in the sector." Luminara's eyes narrowed slightly. The mention of the Xanthor tightened the air around her, a subtle shift, but Carlos noticed. He wondered about the scars she carried, not just on her skin, but in her spirit, carved by those same creatures. She leaned forward, her attention now fully on the mission. "I'm familiar with their tactics," she said crisply. "The Xanthor don't just attack, they obliterate. If they're moving towards Virex, we need to be ready to intercept." Carlos nodded, impressed despite himself. Agreed. But we need to do more than just intercept. We need to understand their movements, predict their strategies. He paused, watching her reaction. That's why we're being teamed up. Your scouting expertise combined with my tactical experience. A flicker of annoyance crossed Luminara's features. She was used to working alone, her missions solitary ventures into enemy lines where silence was her companion and stealth her ally. The idea of partnering with someone, especially a human, seemed to chafe against her instincts. Yet the gravity of their task was not lost on her. Fine, she conceded, her voice a low murmur. But we do this my way. We stay silent, we stay hidden, and we hit them before they even know we're there. Carlos studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. Understood. Stealth is our priority. He extended his hand across the table, an offering of truce and partnership. Luminara stared at his hand, the lines of her face softening slightly. With a slight hesitation, she placed her own hand in his, her grip firm. It was not a gesture of friendship, but of alliance. A necessary union of stars colliding in the vast, indifferent universe. As they shook hands, the screens around them flickered, displaying the coordinates of their next battleground. In that moment, their mission crystallized into focus, a shared path forward laid out beneath the uncaring gaze of 1,000 distant stars. They were no longer just a celestial and a human, but two soldiers against a common foe. And in that unity, there was a whisper of something potent, perhaps the first hint of trust. Chapter 4: The Edge of Cooperation. The cold metal walls of the Nova cruiser's briefing room felt oppressive, reflecting the tension that crackled in the air like static. Luminara Zen stood rigid, her posture betraying none of the turmoil that churned within her. Across the room, Lieutenant Don Carlos shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze occasionally darting toward Luminara with a mix of curiosity and caution. Commander Tyrell's voice cut through the tension as he outlined the mission. The colony on Viridian III has reported suspicious activities around their perimeter, possibly Xanthor scouts. We can't take any risks. You two will lead the reconnaissance team. Luminara, your scouting experience is unparalleled. Carlos, your strategic insights will be crucial. You'll need to work together seamlessly. The briefing ended with a palpable sense of urgency. As the crew dispersed, Luminara approached the holographic map, studying the terrain of Viridian III with a furrowed brow. The planet was a patchwork of dense forests and jagged mountains, with the colony nestled in a narrow valley, perfect for an ambush. Carlos joined her, his hands clasped behind his back. I've read the reports from your last encounter with the Xanthor. You handled yourself well, he said, his voice a careful blend of respect and diplomacy. Luminara didn't look up. Reports can be embellished. There's no embellishment in survival, Luminara. You're here, and that's what counts. Carlos replied, his eyes holding hers once she met his gaze. Their first joint task was to inspect the armory, ensuring their team would be equipped for any encounter. As they checked each weapon and piece of armor, their movements around each other were stiff, like mismatched gears trying to align. The journey to Viridian III was tense, with both of them spending hours in the cockpit, making small adjustments to the flight path, and checking and rechecking their equipment. The silence between them was thick, filled only with the soft hum of the cruiser's engines. Upon entering the planet's atmosphere, Luminara's grip tightened on the controls. The cruiser bucked slightly under the buffeting winds, a prelude to the unpredictable nature of their mission. Carlos watched her handle the controls with an expert touch, her eyes scanning the arrays of data with practiced ease. They landed under the cover of night, the darkness enveloping the ship as they disembarked with their team. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the Nova cruiser. Luminara led the way, her senses heightened, every sound and shadow under scrutiny. As they neared the colony, the silence was broken by a soft rustling from the underbrush. In an instant, Luminara had her weapon drawn, her body poised for action. Carlos signaled to the team to hold their positions, his own weapon ready. A small rodent-like creature emerged, its eyes glinting in the light from Luminara's torch. The tension broke slightly, but the moment served as a stark reminder of the ever-present danger lurking in the shadows. They continued their patrol around the colony's perimeter, their steps synchronized, a silent acknowledgement of the trust that was beginning to form. Carlos covered Luminara's blind spots, and she did the same, their previous reservations giving way to a budding partnership. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Luminara and Carlos surveyed the area one last time. No signs of Xanthor activity had been found, but the mission was far from over. Standing atop a ridge overlooking the colony, Carlos turned to Luminara. "I think we might just make a good team after all," he said, a hint of a smile breaking through his earlier reserve. Luminara looked out over the valley, the first rays of sun reflecting in her eyes. "Maybe," she conceded, allowing herself a small smile. "Maybe we will."